It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast, episode 105. Hello and welcome to this episode of It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. My name is Ken Zimmerman Jr., and this is the podcast dedicated to the history of professional wrestling between the 1860s and 1930. And in this episode, I'll be discussing one of the early feats of strength of the 19th century pioneer Japanese wrestler Sorakichi Matsuda. I had said in past episodes that if there was money in strongman competitions, which there isn't today and there wasn't back then, Sorakichi Matsuda could have been a professional strongman and probably pound for pound the strongest man in the world. But first, I just wanted to go over a couple of things. The first is that the Nielsen's new rating system has kind of been a little controversial in the pro wrestling community because in general, all of the ratings are down across the board. Some of the reasons for that is the numbers could be more accurate, and the numbers were a little inflated before. And I also think that wrestling is kind of in a down period after the initial euphoria of Vince moving on and Triple H taking over the creative. You sort of had this kind of the honeymoon period is over and people are starting to look at it with a little more critical eye. And while I think Paul Levesque is a much better creative person than Vince McMahon, it is getting a little stale. And they have had some curious booking and creative decisions over the last few months. And then you've got the company basically becoming a heel by going out and talking about we're going to maximize our profit margins because Vince McMahon was pricing for families instead of trying to maximize the revenue streams. Well, I think one of the reasons Vince was trying to price for families was to maximize revenue streams because I'm doubting that this ESPN moving the premium live events to the ESPN app has had the effect they thought it was going to have because if the ratings were all that great, we would be hearing about them from both WWE or TKO and ESPN, which we've not been hearing. So my guess is that there's a lot of resistance. A lot of wrestling fans were ticked off because of not only the high prices for what they used to watch for probably $10 to $20 a month is now going to cost them $100 a month. You also have people basically being priced out of being able to purchase seats at the live events now. And this strategy could definitely blow up in their face. They did what I thought was impossible, and Mark Shapiro, who is, I think, the CEO of TKO, whatever his title and whatever his position, he's managed to make Vince look good for the first time in about 5 years, and that is very hard to do. On the other side, you have AEW, which has got a new TV deal, which was very lucrative, but they are continuing to talk about how great their programming is, but the ratings just don't back that up. And I don't think that these AEW vaunted ratings on Max are that great either, because again, you're not hearing about their great ratings from either AEW or Cinemax. You're just hearing people opine and take wags at what those numbers are. And I don't think it's nearly as high as some of these wags have tried to make people think it is. If you just look at the ratings, and I'm talking about before Nielsen went to the new system, you had a program that in 2019, 2020, 2021 was starting out with close to 1 million people. They would start out with that big number and then they would lose a couple thousand, 100,000 people, but they would end in the 7 to 800,000 pretty consistently because that was their base core audience. Now they will start at that number and drop 100 or 200,000 viewers over the course of the show. What that is showing you, and I'm not talking week to week, I'm talking about if you look at the numbers over a 6 month period and average them out, they're averaging now starting in the sevens or eights, sometimes lower, and finishing with 500,000, 600,000 viewers. And what that's telling you is not only have they lost the casual fans and lapsed wrestling fans who were going to check out this new product, they have also lost part of their core audience. And they can try to spin it any way they want. That is not the recipe for success for any company. When you start losing the diehards, you're in some big trouble. And I think professional wrestling as a whole is going to struggle if they don't change some things. And that's because the audience for professional wrestling is dying out. If you look at who was buying subscriptions to the WWE network, it was people in my age category and much older. I am one of the younger people that can remember the territory days of wrestling. Dan came in as the territories were almost all dying, but he still preferred territory wrestling over the stuff we saw after the 1990s. And the stuff from the late 80s into the mid 90s was terrible. Then we had a respite where WWE, because of competition, got pretty good for about 3 or 4 years. And then they really started to devolve after WCW went out of business. They didn't have the competition, but also at the same time as when they went into all these writers and thinking that they were putting on Oscar winning performances, Emmy winning performances, instead of sticking with what they had done to get them in the position they were in. WWE is making a ton of money, but they're also playing to a much smaller audience than what they had during the height of the Monday Night Wars. You've had 13 to 15 million people that just said, "No, I'm done," and left then. I was a little bit more hardy. I tapped out a few years after that and wouldn't even be paying attention to modern wrestling today if it was not for the fact that I'm doing this podcast. The one great thing about professional wrestling back in the territory days is generations of families would come to the wrestling events. My grandfather didn't like wrestling, but he had liked it when he was a kid because he went with his uncle. And they would go to the Coliseum cards in St. Louis. And I'm sure that he saw some of those big matches of the 1920s. There's no doubt in my mind. He saw Jimmy Londas quite a bit. Then my natural father was a wrestling fan because he always talked about Duke Kiamuka. Now, growing up in Scott City, Missouri, I don't know how he saw Duke Kiamuka. The only thing I can think of, because that would have been tri state territory, I believe, at the time. I think Memphis might have eventually started running in Cape because they're pretty close. But at the time, I don't think Memphis went to Scott City. I think it was still tri state. It was Arkansas, Oklahoma. And I know Leo McGurk and Sam Avey had a relationship with the Texas office too. So maybe they booked Kiamuka or maybe they played Kiamuka's matches from Dallas. I know there's a lot of surviving matches from the Dallas Sportatorium in the 1950s. But somehow he saw Duke Kiamuka and he was a fan. And he was initially the person that got me watching wrestling. He was watching it in the 70s on Wrestling at the Chase, and I started watching with him. He wasn't around much longer after that. When him and my mom got divorced, he was up here for about a year, and then he moved back to Scott City, and I only saw him sporadically. But my mom and dad got married by that point in time, and my oldest sister Vicky would take me to the matches all the time. I started off as a fan with my natural father, then my sister. We used to go to the matches all the time, and then as I got older, I would go to the matches with friends and I'd go to the matches with Danny. And then eventually I would go to matches with my younger sister and my brother in law because they were big wrestling fans. So you had this familial ritual where you would go and you would watch and you would talk about it. Well, with the money they're spending on tickets now, that's getting harder and harder to do. And I know out of all of us, the only one of our kids who are fans of wrestling is my sister Sherry. Her kids grew up because my sister and my brother in law never quit watching. So they grew up watching wrestling. But my kids, my sister Vicky's kids, Sister Beck's kids, nobody else in the family watched, and their kids didn't watch, so they're not wrestling fans now. Professional wrestling has to reverse that, or they're going to be in big trouble trying to have a fan base because your fan base is going to die out. A few things, though, could save it. One, wrestling could get hot again. And I thought about this the other day, listening to one of Jim Cornette's podcasts where he was talking about Dallas wrestling and how if the Von Erich boys had not come along, that territory would have probably aged out like Detroit and the Bruisers territory, and quite frankly, Central States. A lot of those territories, that's what happened is they aged out. And I think he's 100% correct because the Von Erich boys made that territory hot. But at first, they made the territory hot in Dallas. It was when the Freebirds came in and they got syndication going, they became big all over the United States. But prior to that, they just heated up Dallas with the introduction of the Von Erich boys. And it got me to thinking that when you look at the really hot times in wrestling, they were always around a big mega star who's who stood out above everybody else. He was not necessarily the best wrestler, but he was the biggest star. So I don't think anybody believes Hulk Hogan was ever the best wrestler anywhere that he was in any company. But he was the biggest star in wrestling and one of the biggest stars wrestling has ever had. When professional wrestling blew up in the 1980s, it was because of Hulk Hogan. When you go back in time, professional wrestling was a very small niche spectator sport that would draw hundreds of fans to the matches until Evan Strangler Lewis. Evan Strangler Lewis developed a reputation for being so sadistic when he almost killed Sorakichi Matsuda in Chicago in 1886. It's going to be the subject of our history content for today. That he became the first true heel in professional wrestling. And he didn't really have to work at it. He just had a vicious personality and he just tended to make fans mad with the tactics he used. So he was the first big heel and he would draw 3 to 6,000 fans in Chicago because everybody wanted to see somebody beat him. That was the first time anybody really drew those kinds of numbers in professional wrestling. And you would have in the 1890s, you would have various people, but then Frank Gotch came along. 1899 to 1913 was his career, and he was the first huge American wrestling hero. Even though he would rely on dirty tactics in the ring, the fans overlooked that. He got extremely favorable coverage in the press, and he was one of the first American sports heroes that was a wrestler in the United States. Pay wise, he was comparable with the heavyweight boxing champion, James J. Jeffries. They would have been the two highest paid athletes at the time. Then you have kind of a down period after Gotch retires. Stecker is becoming a star, but with the emergence of Ed Strangler Lewis and the Goldust Trio in the 1920s, business gets hot again. But it wouldn't be as hot as it would get in the 1930s with the introduction of introduction with Jim Londas becoming a national box office sensation. Londas had actually been around since the teens. He really became a big box office attraction in St. Louis, and he parlayed that into the rest of the country. And by the time he wrestled Ed Strangler Lewis in Chicago's Comiskey Park in 1934, they drew the first gate of over 30,000 fans since the second Gotch versus Hackenschmidt match in 1911. Then you have the 1940s. World War II is part of this as well, but it's kind of a lull time for professional wrestling. You do have, oh, he was our St. Louis Booker forever and a day, Bill Longson. While Bill Longson is the biggest star of the 1940s, but wrestling is, it's kind of a dull, not a dull, a lull or a low time. It's not one of the boom periods. Along comes the median of television in the 1950s, and you had professional wrestling filmed from Chicago and Los Angeles every week. Chicago probably had the much better wrestling show at the time, but Los Angeles had Gorgeous George, who also wrestled on the Chicago TV as well. But Gorgeous George became a huge star and it popped the business again. He was never world champion. The 60s and 70s was really the heyday of territory wrestling. You had people consistently coming out to the wrestling shows every week. It wasn't like the money that Ed Strangler Lewis would get or Hulk Hogan would get, but it was good money for the people that were on top. So you had the world champions who made quite a bit of money. And then in the Northeast, you had Bruno, who really led to some very lucrative times for Capital Wrestling in both the 60s and the 70s. Then, of course, we've already talked about Hogan. Then you had the emergence of Stone Cold Steve Austin in the mid to late 90s. And he is the reason that WWF, which would soon become WWE, was able to go public because he was a huge star. Professional wrestling tends to be a star vehicle. So when you think of a star vehicle, that's a movie term. Think of the movies of Charlie Chaplin. Those movies were created to show the physical comedic skills of Charlie Chaplin. Think of an action adventure movie with, let's talk about maybe The Rock or Jean Claude Van Damme, Sylvester Stallone. Those films were all created, the Rocky, those were all created to show their physical ability and their action adventure choreography, fighting ability. Those are star vehicles. They're not trying to make the Academy Award. It's just those films are made to highlight the physical abilities of the star of that movie. It won't get an Oscar nomination, but it'll probably entertain a lot more people. And professional wrestling functions as that too. Roman Reigns is not the best wrestler in WWE, but he is the biggest star in professional wrestling, bar none. I know the AEW fans would like to think Jon Moxley is on that level, but he is not. He does not have the kind of recognition and star power that Roman Reigns has. It's undeniable. I think AEW, the person with the most star power on that show, is actually Hangman Adam Page. Not saying the booking is great. I'm just saying if somebody that I think has star quality and it factor, I wish he did a lot less of the garbage wrestling. It is Hangman Adam Page. So my main content for this week is actually not a wrestling match. It is a strength contest between two wrestlers. One of the wrestlers is Sorakichi Matsuda, who stood about 5'5". If you put socks on him, maybe he got up to 5'6", and weighed anywhere between 155 pounds and 180 pounds, depending on his lifting schedule, when he was a professional wrestler in the 1880s. Tragically, Matsuda would get tuberculosis, which at that time was a death sentence, and he would pass away in, I believe, 1892 at only 32 years of age. So at the end of May 1885, Captain James C. Daly, who is the other wrestler I'm going to talk about, and James Daly was the kind of guy you would think would be in a strongman competition. He was 6'2", 6'3", and weighed between 260 and 265 pounds. And realize this is 1885. So Captain Daly was as rare as a unicorn when it came to people being that big. And there was a traveling German strongman by the name of Emil Voss who had lifted R.K. Fox's club. So R.K. Fox was the editor for the Police Gazette, one of the biggest magazines in the 19th century. And one of the things that they would do, besides publishing the rules for boxing and wrestling and bare knuckle prize fighting, they would, not only capture contests and stuff in that magazine, besides some of the more tabloid type stories that they would write, they were also the sponsor of lifting competitions. And they had this club, and I've never seen a picture of it, so I can't say if it was an Indian club or not, but I don't think it was. But this club weighed 150 pounds. And Voss, this traveling German strongman, had lifted this club 7 times. Prior to Voss lifting that 7 times, no one else had lifted it more than 4 times. And these challenges would happen at the office of the Police Gazette. They would have these clubs here, they would take pictures, and then they would publish the results in the magazine. And so Captain Daly challenged Voss to show up at the offices of Fox Publication, and he said he would put up $250 against the same amount from Voss to see who could lift the club the most times. Well, Voss just decided, no, I'm not putting 250 up. I'm not risking that. And he doesn't show up. However, Sorakichi Matsuda, who lived in New York, did show up at the offices of Police Gazette. And he didn't have $250, but he said he would accept Daly's challenge, and they could both bet $10 that Matsuda could lift the club 10 times. Daly knew Matsuda, and Matsuda and Daly wrestled a competitive match the first time they wrestled, but they would wrestle a few more times after that, and I believe they worked every one of those matches. I don't believe it. I know they worked every one of those matches. By that point in time, Matsuda's early matches in the United States were contests. As he got used to and started to, well, got used to, as he learned more about American professional wrestling and he became friends with many of the wrestlers, he was very well respected. And despite the racism of the time, a lot of the wrestlers considered Matsuda a friend, and they would call him by his nickname, which was Matt. Daly said, "Oh, Matt, do you really want to do that?" And Matsuda said, "Yep." And so Daly said, "Okay, $10. You lift it 10 times." And Matsuda walked around this club, which was about 4 feet tall and about 2 feet in diameter. So it could have been shaped like a Persian club, but I don't think it's a traditional Persian club we think about when we think about the ones that the Sheik used to lift. Matsuda picked up the club and proceeded to pick it up 11 times. So realize Voss had the record at 7 when both Matsuda and Daly showed up at the Police Gazette. And before Voss, who was mid 200s, he was shorter. I think he was between 5'9" to 6 foot tall, but think more closer to the 5'9", 5'10". My recollection is that he was not 6 feet tall, but he was about 4 feet wide. He weighed about 250, 260 pounds. Yet here's Matsuda, who at this time in 1885 weighed about 170 pounds, picking this club up 11 times. Daly and the editor, so the R.K. Fox was not there that day, but the editor, Mr. Harding, who was often the referee in these contests, was there, and he looked surprised and Daly looked shocked. And Daly, who shows up supposedly with $250 to see off this challenge by Voss, refuses to pay $10 to Matsuda because he had not shown his $10 prior to lifting the club. And Daly said, "I thought you were fooling, Matt." Matsuda counted out $10 and agreed to lift the club more times than Daly. So they both hand Mr. Harding the $10. Daly takes off his shirt, approaches the club, and lifts it 14 times. That's twice Voss's earlier feat. So it's probably a very good thing for Voss that he did not show up. It's best he took the train and got out of town. Daly figures he's won the match and getting ready to count his $20 and figure out where he's getting ready to go. When Matsuda comes up to the club again, that he's already lifted 11 times and lifts it 18 times without stopping. Daly could not believe it, and Harding was so impressed by this feat of strength that he ran over and grabbed Matsuda's hand and was shaking it and said, "That's the most marvelous exhibition I ever saw." Harding handed Matsuda the $20, of course. If you could make a living as a professional strongman, Matsuda would never have had to climb into the ring because he is outlifting people that outweigh him by 100 pounds. And this is only one of the feats. I have most of the feats in the book on his life, Wayfarer in a Foreign Land, that he would complete between 1885 and 1889. What shocks me is that he contracted tuberculosis. He has it for sure by 1889. He might have had it as early as 1888. And he had had a couple bouts where they thought that he might not survive. Yet he not only survived, he was doing strongman competitions till at least a year before he passed away. And he wrestled up until a few months before he passed away, maybe 2 or 3 months. But I mean, he wrestled right up until just a couple of months before. What's shocking about that is that he spent the last 2 months at a club for Japanese businessmen, sporting men, etc. He lived in the hotel across the street from that. So he would walk across the street from the hotel to go to the club each day. It would take him 30 minutes to walk from the hotel across the street to the club in the last month that he was alive. On the day that he died about between 3 and 4 in the afternoon because he walked across the street from the hotel, and the exertion from walking across the street to the hotel caused him to have a heart attack, and he died right there in the lobby of the Japanese Sportsman Club. Yet he was in the ring 2 to 3 months before that and was doing strongman competitions 6 months to a year before that. The amount of pain and the physical disability that he must have had to overcome to be able to do that is unfathomable. It's incredible that he would be able to do that when just a couple months later it would take him 30 minutes to walk across the street and the exertion would force him to have a heart attack and die. Matsuda was only 32 years old when he passed. Besides the feats of strength, he also was a very capable professional wrestler. No less than Martin Farmer Burns said that if Matsuda had been a couple inches taller, he would have been unbeatable as a professional wrestler. Had he lived, Matsuda would have probably been a much more well known wrestler, but tuberculosis, and he might have also been able to, his dream was to learn American professional wrestling and take it back to Japan. Now, he wasn't the last person that had that idea. Taro Miyake, Oki Shikina. There were a number of Japanese professional wrestlers that came to the United States and had the idea of taking professional wrestling back to Japan, but it would eventually be Ricky Dozan who would take the American style of professional wrestling to Japan and popularize it. The only other thing I would like to say about Matsuda before we close out on the main content this week is despite the racism of the time, not only was Matsuda popular with the other wrestlers, he became a fan favorite. When Strangler Lewis tried to choke him to death in January of 1886 and then tried to break his leg the following month, that created a lot of sympathy from the fans. And Chicago was the biggest wrestling city at the time. and the newspapers all covered those matches. And it made him a sympathetic figure. And for the rest of his career, the fans generally cheered for Matsuda. They definitely booed anytime he would get near somebody like Lewis, because I thought that that was the only two matches they had. They actually wrestled one more match in 1888. Matsuda would be a fan favorite for the remainder of his career. So from 1886 to 1891, fans cheered Matsuda and generally rooted for him to beat his opponents, which is almost unheard of in that day when he would have been wrestling American wrestlers. Matsuda was a fascinating guy. A lot of the things he did were interesting. The last thing I had is I am working on the second edition of the St. Louis Civil War, the streetcar strike in 1900, but I am making very heavy weather of it. And I think part of it is I had forgotten how violent this strike was. Even on good days during the strike, there were gunfights, there were people pegged with bricks. Children were getting caught in the crossfire all the time. Children were shot. Fortunately, I don't think any of the children that were shot were killed, but you could imagine the kind of psychological damage that would do to a child that, they've got to now live with for the rest of their life. So because it's such a depressing subject, I think I've been dragging my feet on it because I've really made some heavy weather of it. So I think what I'm going to do is, and I've done this once or twice in the past, and usually I end up going back to the main project just to get it off my plate. But I am going to, in parallel, because I did this before with the Sherlock Holmes of St. Louis book, although eventually I kind of focused on it for like a month to get it out the door. In parallel, I am going to work on a project, but I'm not going to do the 10 wrestlers from the 19th century because that one's frustrating me too. I'm actually going to do a book project on Ad Santel. I was thinking about doing that for a while, and I've been doing some research on him for some stuff for future podcasts, and it just hit me. Now is the time to do this book. So I'm going to work on those books in parallel. My goal is to probably get Santel's book out early 2026. I would still like to finish the streetcar strike book by November, but it might get pushed to December. I might even have to wait till January. But I'm going to start working on those projects in parallel because the one is just way too depressing. It's a super important part of St. Louis history, particularly for that time frame, because so many things that followed that were because of the streetcar strike. The Boodling investigations in the 1903. Chief Desmond, after him and his detectives successfully led the security for the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, he would be summarily dismissed 3 years later because one of the lawyers for the strikers, who would go on to become the circuit attorney and then would go on to become governor of Missouri, felt that his investigation had been impeded by some police officers, which it was, but it was done under the orders of that old board that had been under the previous governor. And since a police commissioner in those days could fire a police officer even without cause, the police officer was between a rock and a hard place. Do what the commissioner told him or be fired. And so, as long as the order was lawful, and you can drive a truck through that definition, the police officers had to follow the direction. Folk empowers a new board of police commissioners who want to get rid of a lot of these police officers. The argument that Chief Desmond and the police chief at the time, Chief Desmond is the chief of detectives, said, we don't think you should fire anyone who was following a lawful order from the Board of Police Commissioners, because the Board of Police Commissioners could summarily terminate them if they didn't follow the order. The police board said, oh, that's okay. We'll get rid of both of you, and then we'll get rid of all of them too. The streetcar strike had far reaching implications for the next 10 to 15 years in St. Louis. And it was a class war that most people don't know about. So it is an important part of St. Louis history. I do want to write the second edition, which is going to do a much better job of covering that chapter in St. Louis history. But boy, it wears on you. So that's going to be it for this episode. KenZimmermanJr.com is the place to check out the show notes for today's episode. They will be at KenZimmermanJr.com, episode 105. I will have a picture of Sorakichi Matsuda up there. You can also see what I'm working on currently, and there's a list of books I have written if you're interested in digging deeper into this era of professional wrestling, or St. Louis history for that matter, if your interest has been piqued. Thank you for listening today. I would also be grateful if you would rate this podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to the show. That helps tremendously with keeping the podcast visible so people who have never heard of it can discover it. If you've already done this, thank you so much. And then if you would like to comment on this episode or ask a question, please go to kenzimmermanjr.com, find the contact page at the top of the navigation, and drop me an email. I would love to hear from you. If you are someone who consumes the podcast on YouTube, you can also leave a comment on YouTube. I do try to answer those as best I can. There's a couple times during the year that I'm probably not going to be able to get back to them, but so far I've been pretty successful in responding to comments. Until next time, take care, everybody. Bye bye.